You're listening to the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast, and I'm your host, Matt Wyatt. If you love crappie fishing, you probably know a lot or have been to Enid, Sardis, Grenada, Arca, Butler, the best crappie fishing reservoirs in America, right here in Mississippi. And the man who knows more about them than I do and you and maybe us put together, fisheries biologist Keith Mills here at MDWFP.
This episode of the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast is brought to you by the Foundation for Mississippi Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks.
You're listening to the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Wyatt. I bet you love crappie fishing. And if you don't love crappie fishing, I bet you love eating crappie. And so that means by osmosis, you like crappie fishing. Somebody who knows about it and knows about the best places in our state, some of the best to catch them. Keith Mills, fisheries biologist, longtime biologist here at MDWFP on the show. Keith, welcome to the show. Good to see you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So here at MDWFP since 1986.
Yes, sir.
Just a few short years ago.
Yeah, just like yesterday.
If we go all the way back to sort of the beginnings for you, how'd you wind up at Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, Parks back in 86?
I sent in a job application and I got hired. So that's basically how I'm here.
Where were you before?
I was working for a private pond company for a while before I came here. And prior to that, I was a grad student at Auburn.
Okay. Yeah, I was looking back in the history, North Carolina State, as you mentioned, Auburn in there, and then over here to the state of Mississippi. How does a boy from North Carolina get into this line of work?
Well, I grew up basically in the woods. The state trout hatchery was just, about maybe 200 yards down the road from my grandparents' house. And, they were friends. They were actually the nearest people to us. And, the manager of the hatchery was my grandmother's first cousin. Okay. So, it was like family. And, when my sister and I were little, that was where we would go, trick or treat. The only place we would go trick or treat. But anyway, I didn't really start fishing until I was about 13, and then I was ruined. And I knew I wanted to get into fisheries management, and I got a degree in biology from North Carolina State, and then got a master's in fisheries biology from Auburn University, and then I told you the rest of the story.
And then the rest is history. Now, currently, you're up in the Sardis area, and you work at the reservoirs,
right,
which are the premier crappie fisheries really in the world, and certainly around here. When did you kind of get to that area and begin to work with those reservoirs? When did that start?
Well, that started, my first day on the job, pretty much. We were, when I got there, we were doing a creel survey on Enid, and we were doing electrofishing on, I believe, Sardis and Grenada that fall. And we were actually in the second year of a 3-year drought. And, when we were by 1988, 2 years later, we were still in a drought, and we had also had the crappie-thon. If anybody remembers that, it was like a 2-month tagged fish deal where if you caught a fish that had a certain tag, it might be like tangled free tom and be worth $20,000 and stuff. Okay. And, that extra pressure, put a hurt on, it was only on Sardis, and it put a hurt on the lake. Of course, at that time, we had a, 50 fish creel limit.
In the 80s?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, I went back and looked at some of our older limits, and in the 1955, we had a statewide 20 fish crappie limit.
Okay.
And then they bumped it up twice in the 1960s to 30 and then to 50. I'm not really sure why. Of course, there was no pole limits. There was no boat limits. There was no, it was pretty much wide open.
Wide open, yeah.
And by fall of 1988, our crappie were averaging less than a half a pound.
Wow.
And, yeah. Oh, yeah. And, we had a lot of folks that were quite upset. And just a couple of years earlier, the first size limits on crappie at all in the country were being done by Missouri. And I looked at, what they were doing in their data, and they had done age and growth stuff and seen that their fish were all young. It's not like they were stunted. They just weren't growing old enough to get big. And we saw the same thing. We did age and growth studies, and so we proposed the first size and number limits on Sardis in fall of 88, and they were enacted in 1989. We had a 25 fish creel limit, which was half, the statewide limit, and a 10-inch size limit. And by just a little over a year later, our size had improved significantly, and we interviewed our fishermen on the lake, finding out what they thought about and if the limits and if they felt that like they'd improved the fishing. And we had a 90% approval rate. I mean, you get a 90% approval on anything, that's good.
That's right.
And we, Fisheries Bureau, started looking at, maybe there's something going on here. Mm-hmm. And we were doing some research with, us, Mississippi State. Ole Miss was in there on some of it, looking at age and growth and some other things. And we were seeing, even back then, that we were seeing a pretty good drop-off in crappie numbers after they got to age 3, which is about the age that they get big enough to catch and, keep.
Okay.
And so, we proposed a change in the statewide limit based on what we were seeing at Sardis.
And that was, so when you mentioned what was done at Sardis, that was 89 or going into the 89 spring. Yeah. So the statewide limit then came around when?
In 92.
92.
Excuse me, 91. 91.
Okay. So we really just a year later, basically.
2 years later.
2 years, okay.
We went to a 25 statewide limit.
Okay.
And then we had, at this time, we would do like public hearings around the state, and we got no pushback. But then when we enacted it, there was pushback when there was, I think, Arkansas and Tennessee both had or Alabama, I can't remember which at the time, but they had a 30 fish limit. Okay. And they wanted it to be the same. And we were like, okay, so, the following year we went to a 30 fish limit statewide.
Okay. So there's several things about that. And I wasn't around. So hear you tell the story, I think my first question I thought of was when you go back to 89 and that initial cutting in half the limit on Sardis, it was approved afterwards. It was positive results afterwards. Yeah. But when the decision was made initially at Sardis, we're going 50 you've been able to keep, now it's going to be 25. What was the reaction of people when they heard that's what it was going to be back then? Mixed.
You had a lot of concern that people would leave.
Okay.
Not come to the lake and fish anymore. Particularly with area businesses, and that's understandable.
Sure.
But when the fish are less than a half a pound, they're kind of going to leave anyway.
That's right.
Anyway, we looked at before we presented our recommendations. I had met with a lot of area businesses and around the lake, and that was their main concern, and met with with anglers and found out that, we were getting a lot of concerns because they were not catching, they blamed the Corps. Of course, it wasn't the Corps' fault that it didn't rain, but we'd had 3 years of drought. Mm-hmm. And, it's just one thing after another. But turned out positive. Yeah. In 1989, we got high water. And in 1991 was the flood of record on the 4 reservoirs, except at Sardis, which is still the 73 flood. And so we had kind of a happy joining of good environmental conditions together with the limits, and things just kind of rebounded very quickly. There was kind of over the next few years, kind of a Me Too movement with the other reservoirs. Mm-hmm. And we ended up by 1994, we had a 10-inch 30-fish limit on all 4 of them.
On all 4. And I would think, too, and maybe I'm assuming, but I would think that once you had the positive experience at Sardis, mm-hmm. 10-inch, 30, or 10-inch and 25, mm-hmm. and 90% approval after everyone experienced that for a couple of years, word spreads to to everybody else, yeah. and those that are going to those other reservoirs.
Right, and we also saw that we didn't see any drop off in fishing effort at Sardis. Mm-hmm. The fears of the surrounding businesses were kind of negated. That we didn't see a drop off in fishing effort on the lakes. It actually went up because we're catching bigger and better fish.
Bigger fish.
And like I said, then it was like, I think Enid and then Arcabutla and then Grenada, we just kind of, in some cases we had data, in some cases we didn't have as much data, but it's like, well, they're not like they're stunted up. It's not going to hurt, or it's not like we're going to cause stockpiling. So, but anyway, we got them all the same there. And that rocked and rolled for quite a few years.
Yeah. And so when we look at it now, the reputation of those reservoirs here in Mississippi, of if you want to catch a large trophy, and a lot, but if you want to catch a large trophy crappie, you go to Grenada, you go to Sardis, you go to Enid, you go to Arcabella. That's the reputation. Now, does it all point back to that decision, late 80s, early 90s, to begin that process?
Well, to some extent. I mean, the lakes had always had a good reputation for crappie fishing, and some big ones, not huge. You would get a big one every now and again. But, it was starting that. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So as we fast forward now, mm-hmm. and we sit here in 2024, with the reputation of the lakes, the fishing pressure, and we're living in a time when something came along, live sonar, forward-facing sonar, those kinds of things, popularity of the sport grew. Mm-hmm. That's something that is a factor now, that decisions have been made and worked with here in the state and with the limits to figure out what's the best way to facilitate it now. And that's a part of it, isn't it?
Right. And really we need to take a little step back. Okay. Because before then, in the early 2000s, we had the advent of the, multiple pole, trolling.
Okay. Yeah.
Gaining in popularity. And I think I talked a little bit about the Crappie-thon. That morphed into Crappie USA, which was a tournament trail.
Yeah.
And that started becoming popular. And that was going on through the 1990s and early 2000s, about the time the internet was starting to, connect people to mm-hmm. places they may not have heard of before. Mm-hmm. And we were getting some, record-setting catches at Grenada and Sardis and Arcabutla as far as the tournament trail. And there was only the one, trail at that time. excuse me. And the trolling was the way to go with the tournament guys. And it's just kind of like bass fishing. The average angler picks up on what works the best and how to catch fish faster.
Right.
You know, it's just like whether you're talking about, what to put on, what you can, hype your car to make it go faster, hold the roll better, or whatever know that you're doing. That you're wanting to get a higher efficiency so that you can have bragging rights.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Well, anyway, we did a 3-year study with the pole versus troll, single pole versus the multiple pole. And we found, yes, there is a difference. And, that's when we first started, going with pole limits. And
what year would that have been?
That was, I'm going to say, let me turn the page here.
Okay. I'm going to guess. I'm just guessing. 04? Am I in the ballpark?
We had to have a drought. We had to have another 3-year drought because fishing pressure, most pressure is based on the lake size.
Okay.
Pressure there's fishing effort, which is just hours of, like if you and I go fishing for 5 hours on Sardis Lake, say, well, that's 10 hours of effort.
Okay.
Your 5 and my 5.
Okay.
So, you divide that by, say we're on a pond. Let's say it's a 10-acre pond. You divide that by the number of acres to get pressure. So that's 10 hours, 10 acres, that's 1 hour per acre.
Uh-huh.
Now, if that lake shrinks, your pressure, and you put the same amount of effort on it, your pressure goes up.
Uh-huh. Per acre.
Per acre, right. Because it's a per acre thing. Same thing that if you have a flood and it gets bigger, your pressure goes down because same effort, but bigger lake.
And it's, am I right? It's just math because it's that same fish population concentrated in a little bit smaller area,
right,
versus the number of presentations of lures it's getting in its vision, in its area.
Right. And of course, these lakes lose 70% of their volume and area from summer pool to winter pool.
70%.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you're getting increased pressure. You may have different effort during, say, spring to winter, but you may have the same pressure because of the lake size swells and shrinks.
So a significant drought in the warm part of the year,
oh yes,
really then makes a big difference as it goes through that cycle.
Yeah, like the old song, nowhere to run to, nowhere to hide.
Right. So that happened, and what was the decision then? When you mentioned some of the
we went to a 12-inch limit on Grenada only. Tried it out, and we had also a 20 fish and a 3-pole limit, and we had 5 fish under 12 inches, which that didn't work out well.
Why not?
Have you gotten your 5 yet? Here's one. I've caught more than my 5. We ended up, with the 5 fish under. We were actually harvesting more fish under 12 inches than we were 13 and over.
Okay.
So our average size was actually shrinking instead of rising.
So it was a bit of a backfire.
Yeah. The idea behind it was if you deep hook the fish, it's going to die anyway. So, and it just, people take advantage of it sometimes.
Sure.
Not everybody, but
some do.
yeah.
Well, and so then when it didn't work, regroup, was it?
Yeah, we regrouped. We got rid of the 5 under.
Okay.
And then in the 2007s, we had, like I said, another drought. And we ended up with the, let's see, I want to make sure I get it right. We had, I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but basically we had different regulations on the 4 reservoirs to the point at one time we had 3 different regulations on the 4 lakes.
Okay.
So it was confusing.
Okay, I see.
Because and we actually, when we were doing a creel survey on Enid, we asked folks, well, have you fished one of the other lakes in the last week? And pretty good percentage, it was like 30, 40% of them had. It's like, well, if you heard that they were biting on another lake, would you go there? Well, it's over 60% said they would. And, the lakes are so close together. Mm-hmm. They're like less than a half hour apart in most cases. And so you have a mobile, fishing boat. Now, some people, they only fish one lake. That's their home lake, and that's all they ever fish. But others are not as, what's the word? Loyal. That's the word.
Yeah, loyal. That's it.
Yeah, they're not as loyal to one lake. So if they hear fish are biting elsewhere, they will go elsewhere. Uh-huh. So we decided we would, since the growth rates were they were close enough to the same on all 4 of the lakes, and that we had the same regulations on the lakes for several years, from the 1994 to like 2004. That's pretty good time.
Yeah.
And we went ahead and got a 12-inch limit on all 4.
Okay. And that's a time frame too. You think about 07 around in there where you mentioned the internet earlier and sharing of information and of reports of who's catching what and what size. Right. And that really, the sharing of that information, education sort of of the angling community.
Right.
And now you're at a time where now everybody's got a cell phone by the time 07 rolls around.
And you're getting the social media.
And social media. And I'm seeing someone post a picture on Facebook of
as they're catching it
earlier today.
Yeah.
Well, and I could only think of, you mentioned some that maybe are less loyal to one lake or the other.
Yeah.
I can picture getting a phone call. Hey man, I'm in Eden. You ain't gonna believe what we're doing. What they're biting. And
right.
I can trailer it up and get over there pretty quick before the sun goes down.
Right. And some of these forums, maybe somebody posts a picture, well, somebody else is going to recognize the background. I know where you caught that.
Right. And so fishermen and bass fishermen too now know, if you don't want them to see where you are, you make sure you take a picture where all I can see is the water behind, or else if they see that tree or that building, they're going to know where I am.
Exactly. And they wised up pretty quick.
Yeah.
And because they realized that they would post something and then they would have a lot of company the next week.
Right. It's interesting. So about that time, drought around 07, different things going on at different lakes. Mm-hmm. And we're kind of tracking throughout these decades what your decision-making process was, but what then? What do you do then? Well,
with the 12-inch, we were getting, and when we did it on Sardis, which we had done this in 1989 when we went with the 10-inch. And then when we did in 2009, we went with the 12-inch on Sardis, and like a year after that, we were asking the same exact questions. So how do you like the new regulations? Do you want to keep them? You know, again, we had 90% favorability.
Really?
Okay. Yeah, believe it or not. and wanted to keep them. And we got, I don't know how many times I was against this until we started catching these big fish, and now I like it.
Right. We've talked to some of, to run parallel with that, we've talked to some of the folks at the department, maybe on the deer hunting side.
Yes.
Who've been a part of certain decisions, regulations, or even private lands, recommendations. Here's what you need to do. Same thing. They'll say, they told me at first I was against it. I didn't think it'd ever work. And now I'm glad it did it. The lesson that I see from 30,000 feet is we're fortunate here in the state of Mississippi and that we can trust the people with that badge and that emblem on their shirt at MDWFP that using data and making the best decision for the people that enjoy the outdoors. It's for them and it works.
Yes. And when we had the 10-inch limit for so long on Sardis, we were able to track that over the years. And we were finding out that as time was going on, that the average crappie was getting smaller and smaller. When the trolling thing was getting more and more popular, and folks were, they could double their catch rate with, fishing 4 poles than they could with one. And it's called growth overfishing. In other words, you're catching fish out faster than they can grow to replace the ones that are being taken out. Which,
and I'm sorry to interrupt, but that takes me back to something Larry Pugh said in here, kind of adamantly reminded us and everyone, if you want a big fish, it's got to be an older fish.
Sure, just like deer.
That's the way it works.
You can't shoot all spikes and forkies and see any big ones.
Right.
Yeah. But we had got to the point where at that time was a 30 fish limit, that a 30 fish limit weighed 5 pounds less than it had when we first started, when we first, like after it had been in effect for a year or so and the size had gotten up, then it started shrinking and shrinking. And so they were having to actually catch more fish to put the same amount of fillets per pound in the, pounds of fillets in the freezer. And a 10-inch fish averages a half pound. 12-inch fish averages a pound. So it's like, well, do you want to catch 30 half-pound fish, or do you want to catch, 15 or 20 or whatever pound fish?
Right.
So
answer's pretty obvious there for.
Well, yeah, for most people.
Right. Okay. And so we go to that decision around 2009, and that was post-drought, right? And those limits go in 2009, 90% approval then, and that's with a 12-inch limit, right about that time. What then? Did it just rock on that way for a pretty good little while?
Yes, it did. We ended up going, I mentioned that we had 3 different limits on 4 lakes.
Yeah.
And in 2015, we got them all the same again.
Okay.
Just make life easier, because not only do we have local folks go from lake to lake, you also have out-of-state anglers that are coming in, and, they can't, it's hard for them to keep straight. If I'm on Enid, it's this, and if I'm on Sardis, it's this, and, so we just made it easier all the way around.
And that was 2015, you mentioned?
Yes.
Okay. Where it's all the same.
Right.
And so now let's jump to here this current recent cycle.
Okay. Well, we had, since 2015, we have, I guess it would be unintended consequences, was we have the best crappie lakes in the country. And, of course, everybody found out about it.
Right.
And one thing we had not even thought about was we start having guide services pop up, and that's become a thing, and we have to keep that in mind. And of course, we have out-of-state folks coming.
You mentioned the guide service, that becoming a thing recently. Is that mainly just a thing of recognizing that it raises the constant pressure on the lakes, or is it catch numbers overall that has a big effect on it? I guess what I'm asking is, what major effect does that have?
When we looked at Grenada in 2019, 20% of our crappie parties were guide parties.
Wow. 20%. Okay.
Yeah. So it was, pretty good chunk.
Yeah.
Of course, Grenada gets the bulk of it. But we, of course, enacted a guide license last year.
Mm-hmm.
And the last, 2018, 2020, 2021, we had high water. And I was talking to a guy that wrote for a crappie magazine, and he was out of Kansas City, and he says, "Tell me about the good old days. What was the fish population like in the good old days?" I said, "Well, the good old days was 2022." And that was when, we had a tournament on Grenada with, multiple bags of fish brought in one day, 7 fish limits that averaged over 3 pounds. And we had 4 crappie over 4 pounds brought in.
Wow.
Which is just, you talk about phone blew up,
Sure.
And that 2022 coincided with the water levels going from, up near the spillway or going over for the last couple of years to normal. Uh-huh. It wasn't low. It wasn't like a drought year, but it was, significantly smaller. So, like we talked about, your pressure increases.
Mm-hmm.
And there's less places for the crappie to hide when you don't have all the bushes and trees in the water in the spring spawn. And so the fish are more vulnerable to being found.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, being found is what we call live sonar. Of course, everybody talks about live scope. There's, several different brands.
Yeah.
But the live sonar came out in 2018 and first started again with the tournament guys. And it's kind of like, oh, how much do those cost? Well, that'll never catch on. Right. Thinking that's not going to be a problem.
Yeah.
And then lo and behold, everybody was buying them.
Everybody's buying. I think about, there's this line in the movie Back to the Future, the first one, when Marty McFly has traveled back in time and he's actually in his mother's and grandmother's house. Mm-hmm. They just don't know that's who he is. And he made an offhand comment about having more than one TV in the house, television set. Mm-hmm. And the people in 1955 said, he's just making a joke. Nobody has more than one television in their house.
Right.
Right. And so, 2018, normal people aren't going to pay that to put that in their boat. Now, everybody's got it.
Yeah. Yeah. I have been getting Bassmaster magazine for decades. And I, flip open the latest copy with the guy that won the classic. There's a picture of him in the boat. There's 5 screens in there, 3 in the front and 2 at the console,
and big ones at that.
Yeah, yeah. So,
right.
But
so that is something that, from not just a pressure, mm-hmm. I guess, but from just a pure catch ratio to time on the water, that's changed it.
Yes, we looked at live sonar 3 years, 2021, 22, 23, and we found that there was a significant increase in harvest rate. It increased each year, which, kind of clued us in, okay, there's a learning curve This is showing it went from less than twice. It went from less than twice to 3 times in that 3-year period of your harvest rate was increasing over that 3-year period.
So each year over year, it's going up. And then the rate that it's going up is picking up speed.
Right.
Which then you're in a position where, okay, well, what if you consider all the what ifs? One of the what ifs is, what if we sat here and didn't do anything?
Right. And it also went from, in 2021, 20% of the crappie anglers had live sonar. And by 2023, 70% had live sonar. So it's like, okay, now what?
Yeah.
Because now we have a significant proportion of our crappie anglers have this new technology that enables them to catch fish faster.
Mm-hmm.
We have, lower lake levels, more normal. And then in 2023, Arca-Butler develops a hole in the dam and has to be drained down below Winter Pool and is inaccessible. So we've got 3 reservoirs instead of 4.
And am I right? Last year, summer of 23, wasn't it? Was it full on drought conditions or was it almost drought? I know it was really dry.
It was dry in South Mississippi, but we got enough rain there in North Mississippi that they got up to normal summer pool.
Okay.
It was not. It was drought, but it was the second half of the year instead of the first half when it's the time when it fills up.
Okay,
and when they fill up. As
we get closer to getting into decisions made on what limits are going to be, I think it's probably a good idea to say, and the past examples of back in 89 and then again in 07 and 09, and then you look at numbers in 15 and getting the lakes the same in 15, all those decisions, and even though you have the evidence of every time a decision was made, you come back, there's 90% approval after the fact because you're making good, solid decisions. It's okay to reiterate that the decisions on limits and things are being made not to harm anybody's chances of catching fish. It's right the opposite. The purpose is preserving the population in the fishery for the benefit of the fishermen now and going forward.
Right, exactly. And we're seeing, I guess you would call it self-regulation, where people are used to, we would see no one that would throw back a keeper-sized crappie.
Mm-hmm.
It was basically 0. And last year, it was 4%. I mean, that's not like the 80% that bass fishermen do or 90%. Yeah. But for crappie, 4% is better than 0.
Yeah, pretty significant.
And we're having some of our guys that are out there that are fishing, that are tagging fish and returning them, doing stuff like that. So we're seeing a little more of and that's in some ways that's where live sonar has helped, where they can actually see how many fish are down there, and they can see what size that are being caught or not caught, and there's concern about, hey, we're collectively over harvesting this resource, and how can I be part of the solution rather than part of the problem?
And that's actually maybe a variable in this equation that doesn't get talked about a lot.
No,
honestly. So here recently in the state of Mississippi and at the reservoirs, the limits, how did those change? What was decisions and what are those limits now on crappie at those reservoirs?
Well, we went down from 15 to 10 fish. We're still at 12 inches, still at 4 poles, and the boat limit, which is 3 or more anglers, is 25.
Okay. And how recently? Just that little tweak there.
Tomorrow. The 24th, July 24th. goes into effect.
Goes into effect as word has gotten out, and everyone in those areas, and including the ones that's their home lakes, reaction, feedback.
There was, I guess it's like, y'all need to do something, but not to me.
Sure.
Which is human nature.
Sure.
Because it's not me, it's all those people.
Yeah, it's somebody else's fault.
Yes, it's always someone else's fault.
Yeah.
I call it the phantom they. They are doing this, they are doing that. Yeah. But, me? No, I'm not part of the problem. Sure. But, technically, anybody that's taking a fish out taking a crappie out is part of the problem.
Yeah.
Maybe some are bigger parts than others, but we all had to be part of the solution. So we're looking at trying to get our harvest in line with what the lakes can produce. And we don't have a problem with reproduction. We don't have a problem with growth rate. They grow fast. Reproduction is normally good. Only on severe drought years do we usually have a problem. On average, it's really good. The problem is once they get over the size limit, is keeping them in there long enough to get big enough. We get to 12 inches in about 3 1/3 years on the white crappie, which is over 90% of our harvest. Okay. Black crappie, it takes about a year longer, but they're a tiny fraction, so I don't really count them for management purposes. Mm-hmm. When Grenada is like 99.9% white crappie, I don't worry about the black crappie too much.
Sure.
But so to get to that 3 pound mark, the ones that people, hold up and get on all the Facebook pages or whatever it is, you're looking at, 5 to 7 years. Again, very similar to whitetail deer management. Mm-hmm. You need like 5 to 7 years to grow a trophy deer. Buck, obviously, nobody shoots trophy does, but
yeah, right.
But it's it's the same biological principle. You have to get the age on them to get the size on them. And if we're wanting a really good quality, high, large average fish size, we have got to make sure that we're not harvesting them at the point where they're all gone by 12 and a half inches. Mm-hmm. If we have a 12-inch limit.
Because then the result would be sizes go down, numbers go down, right, which nobody wants that.
Right.
And, I guess that's the thing too, isn't it? It's for, the fishing public, those who this is being managed for, right, as long as they understand, okay, they're doing what's best for the fishery. It's not because anybody's mad. It's not because I'm being punished. We're doing it for the health of the fishery and the population of the fish now and going forward. Here are the examples. 1989, here 90% approval. 2007, 90% approval. You know what you're doing.
I hope so. Been doing it a while.
And time will tell on this too. It's just like anything else.
Sure. And we just can hope that we still have plenty of crappie that folks are proud to go out there and catch and show off and eat into the future. Because that's all what it's all about.
And finally, Keith, like the one thing I didn't really dive into with you, and that might be for another show down the road, but it's always fascinating to me, the gathering of the data. And, you mentioned it's really still the people business for you, isn't it?
Right. Well,
fishermen, business owners, gathering of that information and them being honest with you.
Right. And, we also are doing electrofishing. We're doing trap netting to look at the fish population, sizes of fish that people don't necessarily see. We're sampling the anglers. We're doing creel surveys. We're out on the water, and we're looking at what's in people's live wells, and what sizes and size ranging. All stuff that they're catching. So we are doing that. The times that we're not doing that, we're working up the data.
Yeah, and I know this is almost a repeat of kind of what we just talked about, but sort of to reiterate it. The recent here in 2024, lowering the limit, in response to catch rates and those kinds of things, from your perspective, the purpose and that will serve, the reason that's being done, what is that? How would you answer that?
Basically to keep the fish in the lake long enough to get to the size that they are appealing to the angler and are bringing people to the lakes. Pretty simple stuff. Yeah. It's kind of like you sometimes you got to take your medicine. It doesn't taste good right at first, but pretty soon you get to feeling better.
Right. Yeah. Keith, real pleasure to talk to you. Great to see you here. Thanks for being on. We'll do it again soon.
Okay. Sounds good.
Thank you. He is Keith Mills, fisheries biologist at the best crappie fishing reservoirs in America, and they're right here in the state of Mississippi. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you outdoors.